Good evening, my friend. Settle yourself down, tuck in your blanket, and let the outside world slowly fade into the background. This is your time for a quiet journey into the past, where history moves at a slower pace, with no rush, no sharp edges, and no pop quiz waiting at the end. Just a soft story to guide you toward rest tonight. We're not going to talk about battles or long lists of dates. We're not even going to worry about politics, at least, not in the way historians usually do. Instead, we'll be stepping into the private lives of emperors, the most powerful men of their worlds, who also happen to be some of the strangest characters history has ever produced. Because emperors, for all their crowns, armies, and marble statues, were still human beings. And being human often means being a little odd. Sometimes very odd. Supreme power does strange things to the mind. Imagine having no one who can say no to you. No one to tell you to calm down, to take a nap, to eat something normal instead of flamingo tongues or gold-dusted bread. Imagine being treated like a god every day of your life. After a while, it might start to warp your habits, your fears, and even your sense of what counts as normal. That's where the bizarre habits come in. Emperors didn't just rule, they obsessed. They indulged. They created routines so strange that even their own courtiers must have raised an eyebrow, very carefully, of course, because raising eyebrows at the emperor could sometimes be dangerous. And that is what makes them so fascinating. On one hand, they were the ultimate figures of authority, deciding the fate of nations with a word. On the other hand, they were people who might stay up all night because they were afraid of thunder, or order the construction of enormous palaces simply because they couldn't sleep without a particular view. They could be cruel, paranoid, or extravagant. But they could also be lonely, insecure, and very, very strange. In tonight's story, we'll wander gently through the lives of these emperors, not rushing, but drifting like walking slowly through the echoing halls of a forgotten palace. We'll pause at the strange details, the unusual foods on their plates, the odd clothes they demanded others wear, the strange rituals they performed before bed. We'll notice the mixture of grandeur and absurdity, of supreme power and deeply human insecurity. And as we do, remember this is not the kind of history meant to keep you wide awake, scribbling notes. This is sleepy history. It is here to soothe, to amuse, and maybe to remind you that even emperors, with all their crowns and armies, were still people full of quirks. If you drift off halfway through, don't worry. The emperors won't mind. Their secrets will still be here, waiting in the shadows of history, patient and timeless. So, close your eyes if you wish, or let them grow heavy as we begin. Imagine yourself stepping into a vast marble hall, the floor cool beneath your feet, the air heavy with the scent of incense and old stone. Torches flicker along the walls. Statues of long-dead rulers stare down at you with calm, unreadable eyes. Somewhere, beyond the pillars and the silence, sits the emperor, the most powerful man in the world. But tonight, we are not here to bow to him. We are here to peek gently behind the throne, to notice the odd habits he tried to keep hidden, the strange rituals that made him feel safe, the peculiar routines that remind us he was not so different from us, just stranger, and with a lot more servants. This is the story of emperors at their most human, their most eccentric, and their most bizarre. And with that, let's begin. Daily life of emperors, not so ordinary. Let's begin our slow wander through the world of emperors with something simple, a day in their lives. Of course, a day for an emperor was never really simple. from the moment they opened their eyes, in the morning to the moment they finally drifted into uneasy sleep. Everything was surrounded by ritual, attention, and often a touch of strangeness. Waking up like no one else for most people in the ancient world. Mornings began with roosters, hard bread, and work waiting in the fields. For an emperor, mornings began with silence, attendance, and the knowledge that an entire empire was holding its breath for him. An emperor did not wake up alone. His bedroom was often filled with guards, servants, and attendants who slept nearby, ready to leap into action at the first sound of movement. Privacy was a luxury few rulers had. Even before he spoke a word, people were watching, ready to hand him water, clothing, or news of the night. Imagine trying to yawn, stretch, and rub your eyes while 10 people bowed and waited for your command. Some emperors created elaborate waking rituals. Certain emperors of Rome, for example, believed in consulting astrologers at dawn, asking what the stars predicted for the day. Others insisted on morning massages, scented oils, or a particular order of greetings. Every step of the morning routine became part performance, part superstition, and part control. Getting dressed, emperor-style clothing was never just clothing. For an emperor, what he wore was a statement of power. Colors like deep purple, reserved only for rulers, announced authority before a word was spoken. But some emperors went further, becoming obsessed with how they dressed and how others looked in their presence. One emperor might insist on sandals, laced in a precise pattern. Another might demand robes, so heavy with gold thread that walking became a slow, careful process. Even the act of putting on clothes could involve several attendants, each responsible for a different layer. To outsiders, it looked majestic. To the emperor, perhaps it felt like being wrapped up like a ceremonial gift every morning. And then there were emperors who extended their fashion sense to everyone around them. Some demanded that courtiers copy their style exactly, creating a strange mirror world where dozens of people walked around, dressed like miniature versions of the ruler. Breakfast for a ruler, while most people began their day with bread and perhaps a sip of watered wine. Emperors had kitchens buzzing with activity. Before the sun even rose, exotic fruits, rare spices, and carefully prepared delicacies were available. But food was never just for nourishment. It was a way to display wealth and power. Some emperors insisted on unusual morning dishes like meat drenched in expensive spices or breads flavored with ingredients shipped across oceans. Others skipped early meals entirely, preferring to fast until later feasts. Still, even the smallest sip of wine or bite of bread was part of a grand performance. After all, if the emperor ate figs from the far corners of the empire, it reminded everyone else that he ruled those lands. The endless business of empire once, dressed and fed, the emperor moved to the business of ruling. But business often looked less like sitting at a desk and more like a strange mixture of theater and judgment. Courts filled with officials bringing petitions, generals reporting on wars, ambassadors carrying gifts and messages. The emperor sat at the center of it all, his expression carefully controlled. Every nod, every pause, every question could change the fate of thousands. But here's where the bizarre habits crept in. Some emperors would only meet officials at certain hours, believing the stars dictated the best time for decisions. Others forced petitioners to wait for days, just to show their own importance. And some emperors, tired of the endless flow of people, invented peculiar tests, like judging an ambassador's clothing or a petitioner's posture to decide whether their case was even worth hearing. Afternoons of luxury and quirk after the serious morning rituals, afternoons often became more personal. Baths were a favorite, especially for Roman emperors. But these were not quick rinses. They were elaborate, hours-long experiences with scented oils, warm pools, musicians, and sometimes entire entourages present to watch or even participate. Imagine a spa day that never ended lest the emperor got bored. Some emperors added eccentric touches. A bath might be sprinkled with flower petals, perfumed with incense, or even warmed by special heating systems designed only for the rulers. Comfort, of course. When you're the emperor, you could demand a bath filled with rose water, or milk-hand servants would rush to make it happen. Others turned afternoons into performance time. Some emperors enjoyed showing off skills, singing, acting, or playing instruments while their court politely applauded. No matter how good or bad the performance really was. Evenings in the palaces, the sun set, the emperor's life became even more theatrical. Banquets filled the palace with noise, music, and food piled high. But even here, odd habits appeared. Some emperors preferred to eat surrounded by entertainers, dancers, acrobats, or storytellers. Others used banquets as opportunities to test loyalty, watching carefully who ate what, who toasted enthusiastically, and who seemed hesitant. Wine flowed freely, and with it came looser tongues. Some emperors encouraged this, letting courtiers relax enough to speak honestly. Others grew paranoid, listening for hidden insults or conspiracies. What began as a feast could quickly become a stage for betrayal. The loneliness of power, but behind the endless rituals, the food, the clothes, and the luxury, there was always a shadow. Loneliness. An emperor, surrounded by thousands of people, was rarely truly alone, but he was also rarely truly himself. Every act was watched. Every gesture mattered. Some emperors grew weary of the performance. They retreated into strange habits, finding comfort in routines that made little sense to anyone else. Perhaps it was a way to carve out a small space of control in a world where everyone wanted something from them. And so, a day in the life of an emperor was never ordinary. It was a mixture of majesty and oddity, of power and insecurity, of ritual and whim. The emperor might appear larger than life in public, but behind the golden throne and the marble halls, he was still human, quirky, flawed, and often very strange. As we drift forward, we'll step into the next part of their lives. Food obsessions and strange diets. Because if daily life was unusual, the way emperors ate and what they demanded on their tables was even stranger, and sometimes downright unbelievable. If there is one thing emperors never treated as ordinary, it was food. Meals were never just about filling the stomach. They were displays of wealth, symbols of control, and, often, excuses for very strange behavior. For ordinary people, bread, porridge, and a bit of cheese or vegetables were the staples of daily life. For emperors, food became theater lavish, exaggerated, and sometimes so bizarre that even the cooks must have whispered to one another, "Is he serious?" Banquets. As power plays for an emperor, the banquet table was another throne. Every dish that appeared was a message. Rare spices from the farthest reaches of the empire showed just how wide his power stretched. Whole animals roasted and presented dramatically proved that no expense was too great. Gold and silver plates, glittering in candlelight, reminded everyone that the emperor lived in a different world than they did. But beneath the splendor odd habits often revealed themselves. Some emperors insisted on meals that lasted hours, with dozens of courses served one after the other. Guests were expected to sit patiently while the emperor took his time, nibbling, sipping, and occasionally giving lectures in between bites. Others demanded that everyone eat exactly what they ate, as though tasting different foods might somehow threaten the balance of power. Exotic delicacies, the obsession with rare foods, reached comical heights. Ancient emperors often competed to outdo one another with the strangest delicacies imaginable. Flamingo tongues, for example, were considered a prized dish. Ostrich brains appeared on some menus. Certain emperors even demanded sauces so rich with spices that the cost of one meal could feed an entire village for a year. Why such strange choices? Partly because they could. When you control the empire, you can demand a bird be shipped from thousands of miles away just so you can eat its tongue. But there was also a symbolic reason. Eating what others could not even imagine eating reminded everyone that the emperor stood above ordinary rules of nature and economy. The emperor who ate too much. Not every emperor had refined tastes. Some simply loved food too much. Stories tell of rulers who gorged themselves at banquets, piling plate after plate until servants had to help them stand. These habits weren't just embarrassing, they sometimes became deadly. Overeating led to illnesses, and illnesses led to whispers of weakness. In the dangerous world of palace politics, even indigestion could be interpreted as a sign of decline. And yet, the feasts continued. Emperors often surrounded themselves with endless dishes, even if they barely touched them. The abundance itself mattered more than the eating. To be an emperor was to show that resources were limitless even if those resources ended up wasted. Food as a test of loyalty. Meals also became opportunities to test loyalty. An emperor might watch carefully to see who hesitated before eating, who seemed nervous about the food, or who reached for wine too eagerly. In some courts, refusing a dish was considered an insult. Accepting food too quickly might suggest greed. Every gesture at the table was observed, weighed, and sometimes punished. Poison was always a lurking fear, of course. That meant tasters were common poor servants whose job was to try every dish before the emperor did. Their survival was the signal that the food was safe. One can imagine the tension at the table as everyone waited for the taster to swallow and hopefully keep breathing. Strange rituals around eating beyond the food itself. The rituals of eating could grow quite bizarre. Some emperors refused to dine without music, demanding that flutes, harps, or even choirs perform throughout the meal. Others insisted on dining in complete silence, with only the sound of chewing echoing through vast halls. Strange and perhaps slightly unsettling experience for the guests. Certain emperors believed that the time of day, or even the position of the stars, influenced digestion. Meals were delayed or rushed depending on what astrologers advised. Food was not just about hunger, it was about fate. The emperor who wanted to be a chefon of the oddest habits came from emperors who wanted to participate in cooking themselves. A ruler might wander into the kitchens, demanding to stir a pot or add a spice, while nervous cooks hovered nearby, unsure whether to applaud or panic. Of course, no one dared criticize the emperor's cooking, no matter how questionable the results. If the emperor declared the stew delicious, then, by some miracle, it was the best stew anyone had ever tasted. Feasts that never ended there are stories of emperors who held banquets stretching late into the night, with food served continuously. Guests grew weary, their stomachs aching, but leaving early was not an option. To dine with the emperor was to prove loyalty. Even if it meant nibbling for hours on delicacies you no longer had the appetite to enjoy. Some rulers even turned these endless meals into contests, watching who could keep up with their appetite or lack of it. Food and fear behind. All the glittering dishes and exotic tastes was always a shadow, fear. To eat as an emperor was never just to enjoy a meal. It was to take a risk. Every bite might hide poison. Every guest might hide resentment. Food was both pleasure and potential danger. Perhaps that is why some emperors developed strange eating habits, because routines and rituals gave them a sense of control in a world where control was never guaranteed. So, as we drift gently through their banquets, we see that emperors were not just rulers. They were performers at their own tables, using food to dazzle, intimidate, and sometimes confuse. Their diets might seem strange, even absurd, to us today. But for them, every unusual bite was a reminder of who they were. The most powerful, the most envied, and often the most bizarre. And as the plates are cleared and the torches burn lower, we move on to another part of their strangeness, their obsession with how they looked, because emperors were not just eaters of unusual meals. They were also masters of unusual fashions. Peculiar fashion and appearance fixations food may have filled their bellies, but fashion filled their pride. For emperors, appearance was never just vanity, which politics stitched into fabric, power woven into hair, and ego painted onto skin. How an emperor looked was as important as what he commanded. And so, as you might imagine, their habits around clothing, grooming, and appearance often tipped into the bizarre. The weight of imperial robes. When you picture an emperor, perhaps you imagine a flowing robe of silk or velvet, trimmed with gold, heavy enough to make the shoulders ache. That image isn't far from the truth. Imperial robes were symbols of majesty, sometimes so heavy with embroidery and jewels that moving gracefully became nearly impossible. Servants were needed just to help lift, fold, and arrange these garments. For some emperors, the act of dressing became an entire morning ceremony, with attendants fussing over every pleat. Ordinary people slipped on tunics and sandals. Emperors became walking treasure chests. But some rulers went further. Certain emperors insisted on multiple costume changes throughout the day. One robe for morning councils, another for afternoon banquets, yet another for evening appearances. Each outfit was meant to send a message. I am powerful, I am divine, I am untouchable. And if you had to sew until your fingers ached to keep up with their demands, well, that was simply the price of empire. Color rules, colors mattered. In Rome, purple was the royal shade, dyed from a rare shellfish, and so expensive that ordinary citizens couldn't dream of wearing it. To see an emperor draped in purple was to be reminded instantly of his supremacy. But some emperors didn't just reserve colors for themselves. They dictated what others could wear. Court officials might be ordered to match the emperor's style exactly, creating a strange sea of men dressed like pale imitations of their ruler. Others were banned from wearing certain fabrics or shades, lest they be mistaken for royalty. Imagine living in fear of accidentally choosing the wrong tunic and offending the emperor with your fashion sense. Hair and beard obsessions. Hair was another battlefield of vanity. Some emperors grew their hair long, demanding others copy their style, while others shaved entirely bald, declaring it the mark of discipline. Beards came in and out of favor depending on who ruled. One emperor might punish those who failed to shave properly, while another might fine those who dared trim their beards too short. Emperors could be fickle, and their personal preferences quickly became the law of the land. A bad hair day for the emperor could mean trouble for everyone else. Jewels and odd accessories. Jewelry was more than decoration. Rings, crowns, and pendants announced status, and emperors often collected them in absurd quantities. Some demanded rings for every finger, glittering so brightly in the sunlight that courtiers had to squint. Others loved unusual accessories. There are tales of rulers who wore crowns encrusted with gems so heavy that they gave them headaches, but they wore them anyway. Because what was a headache compared to a reminder of supreme power? And of course, there were rumors of secret jewels, like poison rings with hidden compartments, carried not only as decoration but as symbols of cunning. Even if they never used them, the mere possibility made for excellent intimidation. Perfume, oils, and scents clothing was not the only part of presentation. Many emperors were obsessed with scents. Perfumed oils, baths sprinkled with flower petals, garments soaked in exotic fragrant sisal. Of these became part of their daily routines. Some emperors demanded that entire banquet halls be filled with incense before their arrival. Others traveled with personal scent makers, whose job was simply to ensure the ruler always smelled divine. Ordinary people worried about the smell of sweat and dust. Emperors worried about whether they smelled more like roses or cinnamon. Forcing fashion on others, perhaps the most bizarre habits came when emperors decided that their personal fashion choices should be copied by everyone around them. If the emperor shaved his head, courtiers were expected to do the same. If he wore a particular robe, officials scrambled to imitate it. One emperor supposedly took this even further. Demanding that guests at his banquets appear in costumes he selected for them, turning dinners into strange fashion shows where no one dared complain. It wasn't about beauty, it was about control. Dressing like the emperor was a reminder that your body, even down to your clothing, belonged to his world body image and insecurity behind the jewels and perfumes. Though there were often insecurities, some emperors grew anxious about their weight, their height, or their scars. They disguised flaws with layers of fabric or carefully arranged hair. Statues and portraits were ordered to show them at their best, smoothing wrinkles, hiding imperfections, sometimes even inventing muscles that never existed. Powerful though they were, emperors feared being judged, mocked, or remembered as less than magnificent. Their obsession with fashion and appearance was not always just arrogance, it was also fear. Fear of aging, fear of weakness, fear of being ordinary. The theater of appearance to be an emperor was to live in a theater, and fashion was the costume. Every robe, every jewel, every haircut was part of the performance. And when you are treated like a god, even the smallest details, like the color of your shoes, become loaded with meaning. But here's the strange truth. No matter how splendidly they dressed, no matter how many perfumes they wore, emperors were still human. They sweated under heavy robes. They grew tired of jewels. They probably sneezed when too much incense filled the room. All the splendor in the world could not change that. So, as we step gently away from the closets and mirrors of emperors, we find another realm of their peculiar habits. What happened when night fell? Because emperors were not only strange by day, they carried their oddities into their dreams, their sleepless nights, and their uneasy beds. Sleep, dreams, and nighttime oddities for most people in the ancient world. Nighttime meant rest. A straw bed, a wool blanket if you were lucky, and the soft hum of crickets or the occasional bark of a dog. For emperors, however, nighttime was not always peaceful, with crowns heavy on their heads and paranoia heavy in their hearts. Sleep became yet another arena for their bizarre habits. Uneasy sleep in palaces, a nudgeon lying down in a palace chamber, marble floors, towering pillars, walls covered with mosaics. Sounds luxurious, doesn't it? And yet, for emperors, these very rooms often felt more like cages. Outside the chamber doors stood guards, sometimes dozens of them. Inside, attendants lingered, waiting for any signal. Privacy was rare, and true rest even rarer. Many emperors lived in constant fear of assassination. Nighttime, when the palace was quieter, was when enemies could creep closest. As a result, some rulers developed strange sleeping habits to outsmart potential assassins. They changed beds frequently, never sleeping in the same place twice. Others had multiple rooms prepared each night, slipping into one at random to confuse would-be killers. Sleeping, surrounded by guards. Some emperors insisted on being surrounded by guards even while they slept. The idea of resting while armed men hovered nearby may not sound relaxing, but to paranoid rulers, it was comforting. Certain emperors even forced their guards to sleep inside the bedchamber itself. Imagine trying to fall asleep while half a dozen armored soldiers snored around. Swords clinking softly as they shifted in their sleep. It might not have been soothing, but it was safer, or at least it felt that way. Strange beds and sleeping positions, beds themselves, could become bizarre symbols of power. Some emperors demanded towering beds draped in layers of silk, as though sleeping higher off the ground made them more divine. Others preferred unusually simple beds, perhaps to give the impression of discipline even, if the simplicity involved cushions more comfortable than anything their subjects could dream of. There are tales of emperors who insisted on sleeping, sitting upright, fearing that lying flat made them vulnerable. Others layered themselves with blankets so heavy they became like armor, protection against both cold and intruders. Sleep was never just sleep. It was a negotiation between comfort and fear. Dreams as messages. The ancient world, dreams were not random, they were messages. Emperors, with their absolute power, believed dreams could guide decisions, warn of betrayal, or reveal the will of the gods. Some emperors kept dream interpreters close at hand, summoning them in the middle of the night to explain strange visions. A dream of a bird might be interpreted as a sign of victory. A dream of fire might be read as disaster. The emperor's mood the next day could depend entirely on what images had floated through his sleep. There are stories of emperors changing battle plans, delaying meetings, or even executing suspected enemies all because of a troubling dream. In this way, the most personal, private experience of sleep spilled into the grand stage of empire. Nightmares and paranoia, of course. With power came guilt, and with guilt came nightmares. Rulers who ordered executions by day sometimes found the faces of the condemned returning in dreams by night. Others feared divine punishment, dreaming of angry gods or burning cities. Some emperors became so haunted by nightmares that they avoided sleep altogether. They paced their palaces at night, surrounded by lamps and attendants, trying to outlast their own minds. Sleep, the simplest human need, became something to dread. Strange night rituals to chase away bad dreams or ward off spirits. Emperors often turned to rituals. Incense was burned before bedtime, prayers whispered to household gods, charms placed under pillows, Some wore amulets to bed, convinced that metal or stones could protect them from demons in the night. One ruler reportedly slept with weapons nearby, swords or daggers within reach, in case assassins appeared in the darkness. Another had musicians play softly as he drifted off, preferring to fall asleep to the sound of lutes rather than silence. Sleepless entertainment when sleep refused to come. Emperors rarely tossed and turned in silence. Instead, they summoned entertainment. Courtiers might be ordered to read aloud, poets to recite verses, or musicians to play until the emperor's eyes finally grew heavy for attendance. These sleepless nights could be exhausting. Imagine being woken at 2 a.m. because the emperor had a craving for a story about ancient heroes, or because he wanted a private concert in his chamber. For the emperor, however, this was perfectly normal. After all, when the entire empire bends to your will, why should sleep dictate your schedule? Night, as a time of plots, nighttime was also the most dangerous time for plots. Palaces were never entirely quiet. Servants, guards, and schemers all moved through the corridors. Some emperors used the late hours to meet secretly with allies or lovers, slipping away from prying eyes. Others grew so suspicious of the dark that they ordered constant patrols. Bells rung at intervals, or even artificial lights burning through the night. For them, sleep was not just rested, was vulnerability. And emperors hated vulnerability more than anything else. The human side of sleep, yet, behind all the paranoia and ritual, there was something deeply human in these habits. Emperors feared the dark, just as children sometimes do. They wanted comfort, protection, and reassurance. They sought meaning in dreams, the way many of us still wonder about the strange worlds our minds create at night. Perhaps the strangest part of all is how familiar it feels. Who hasn't had a restless night, lying awake with worries? Who hasn't wished for a little extra security or comfort or a story to lull them back to sleep? The difference, of course, is that emperors could summon entire retinues to satisfy those midnight whims. But in the end, they were still just people lying in the dark, chasing rest. And so, as we leave their chambers and the flickering torchlight of sleepless palaces, we find ourselves drifting into another realm of their peculiar lives: love, desire, and the scandals that followed emperors through their reigns. Because if their nights were uneasy, their romances were often even stranger. If food and fashion revealed the eccentric sides of emperors, their love lives revealed their most dramatic ones. Emperors did not love quietly. They loved in ways that shook palaces, unsettled courts, and filled the pages of history with whispers. Sometimes their desires changed the fate of empires. Other times they led only to heartbreak, scandal, and strange habits that leave us blinking in disbelief even centuries later. Marriage as politics for most emperors. Marriage was never about romance. It was a political contract, binding families, sealing alliances, and producing heirs. A bride might come from across the sea, chosen not for her smile or kindness, but for the land and armies. She brought with her name, but politics could not quiet the human heart. Behind arranged marriages often came lovers, secret or otherwise. Some emperors grew devoted to their wives, surprising everyone by refusing to stray. Others seemed incapable of contentment, surrounding themselves with mistresses, concubines, or entire harems. And with each choice came scandal, because when the private life of a ruler became public, the whole empire paid attention. Love that shaped empire's history tells of emperors who risked everything for love. Some abandoned duty, choosing personal desire over political advantage. Others elevated lovers to positions of power, shocking courtiers and enraging rivals. One infamous emperor placed his beloved on nearly equal footing with himself, parading them in jewels and granting them honors once reserved for generals or priests. Courtiers fumed, citizens gossiped, but the emperor smiled, unwilling to give up his passion for the sake of appearances. Love, in his case, became not a private affair but a spectacle, dazzling and scandalous all at once. Scandals of excessive course some emperors took indulgence to excess. Stories tell of rulers who surrounded themselves with dozens, even hundreds, of partners, collecting them as though love were another treasure to hoard. Palaces turned into stage sets for romance, with chambers devoted to pleasure and courtiers competing for attention. Such excess often bred resentment. Noble families watched their daughters and sons caught up in imperial whims. Advisors worried that an emperor distracted by love might neglect governance. Enemies whispered that such rulers were weak, ruled not by reason but by desire, and yet the emperor's heart cared little for political advice. If he wished for endless romance, he had it. Who could say no to a man who commanded armies? Forbidden loves, not all scandals came from excess. Some came from the forbidden. Emperors sometimes fell for people far below their ranks, servants, actors, musicians. To the court, these relationships seemed outrageous. How could the ruler of an empire lower himself to such affections? But love, as always, ignored such boundaries. In these romances, we see emperors as human beings, reaching for companionship, laughter, and affection where they could find it. Of course, secrecy rarely lasted long. Whispers in palaces spread like wildfire, and soon everyone knew the emperor's secret. Some of these stories ended sweetly, with partners raised to unexpected heights of influence. Others ended in tragedy, as the realities of power crushed what might have been a simple romance. Jealousy and danger desire often brought not just pleasure but peril. Imperial partners could become targets of jealousy, rivals at court sometimes, plotted against favored lovers, knowing that to remove them was to wound the emperor. Poison, exile, or mysterious accidents befell many who found themselves too close to power through affection. Even emperors themselves could be consumed by jealousy. Stories abound of rulers who punished partners for the slightest suspicion. Of betrayal, a glance, a whisper, a rumor, any of these could spark fury. To love an emperor was both a privilege and a danger. Theatrical displays of affections, some emperors turned love into performance. They staged public displays of affection, so dramatic they seemed like plays, parades in honor of lovers, poems written by court poets, banquets where affection was toasted as though it were divine. One emperor famously insisted on appearing in public, dressed to match his beloved, as though the empire itself should recognize their union as something sacred. To courtiers, it may have seemed excessive, even ridiculous. To the emperor, it was entirely natural after all. Why should the most powerful man in the world hide his feelings? Loneliness behind the luxury yet. For all the extravagance, many emperors were lonely, surrounded by courtiers who flattered out of duty and advisors who schemed for advantage. Finding genuine affection was rare. Love, when it appeared, was treasured sometimes too much. Emperors clung to partners with desperation, fearful of betrayal, craving comfort in a world where trust was scarce. And in this loneliness, their habits sometimes turned strange. Gifts became absurdly lavish palaces, jewels, entire provinces granted to a beloved, rules bent, laws ignored, simply to keep affection close. Love became not only romance but survival. When desire became downfall for some emperors, love became their undoing. Too much indulgence, too many scandals, too much disregard for duty, and suddenly loyalty eroded. Citizens muttered that their ruler cared more for passion than for empire. Enemies seized the chance to rebel. Lovers who once brought joy sometimes became the spark of downfall. These stories remind us that even in the grandest palaces, the heart can rule more strongly than the crown. And when the heart led emperors astray, entire empires trembled. The human side of imperial romance still, beneath the scandal, the excess, and the danger, what we see most clearly is humanity. Emperors longed for love, just like anyone else. They yearned for companionship, affection, and trust. Their strange habits of desire, lavish gifts, forbidden romances, jealous rages were not just quirks of power. They were expressions of a universal truth. Even the mightiest ruler is still human, and the heart does not bow to crowns. So, as we drift onward in this sleepy story, we leave behind the candlelit banquets and whispered scandals of love and step into something darker still, the world of paranoia, because emperors who indulged in passion by day often wrestled with fear by night, and when fear ruled them, their habits grew stranger than ever. If love revealed emperors at their most dramatic, paranoia revealed them at their most vulnerable. Supreme power might look majestic from the outside, but from the inside it often felt fragile. The greater the throne, the greater the fear of losing it. And so, many emperors developed habits, sometimes bizarre, sometimes terrifying, meant to guard against enemies real and imagined. The shadow of enemies. Every emperor had enemies. Rivals at court, ambitious generals, jealous nobles, even members of their own family. In fact, especially members of their own family. Brothers, cousins, even sons sometimes became threats. After all, what better claim to the throne than being related to the emperor himself? This constant threat bred suspicion. Rulers began to see danger everywhere, behind curtains, in whispers, even in the eyes of those closest to them. And when suspicion took hold of a mind already burdened with power, strange behaviors followed. Changing beds and hidden chambers. We've already seen how paranoia shaped sleep. But for some emperors, it extended to the architecture of their palaces. Secret passages wound through walls, allowing the emperor to slip unseen from one room to another. Hidden chambers gave them escape routes in case of attack. Some rulers never slept in the same room twice, keeping attendants guessing about their true vocation. Others had decoy beds prepared, complete with pillows arranged to look like a sleeping body, just in case assassins struck in the night. To be emperor was to treat your own home like a battlefield. Testing loyalty paranoia often expressed itself in constant tests of loyalty. Courtiers were asked trick questions, their answers carefully weighed. Generals were rewarded one day and punished the next, just to see if they remained loyal under stress. Meals became traps as well as feasts. A hesitant glance at a dish might spark suspicion of treachery. Too eager a toast might look like mockery. The emperor watched everyone, always calculating, always wondering, who is truly faithful and who is secretly plotting. Extreme punishments. Some emperors took paranoia to brutal extremes. The smallest suspicion could lead to exile, imprisonment, or execution. A careless word at court, a too long glance, even a dream interpreted badly, any of these might seal a person's fate. Servants lived in fear of accidents. Drop a cup near the emperor, and he might decide it was an assassination attempt. Arrive late with a message, and he might assume you delayed on purpose. Living near a paranoid emperor meant living with constant danger, where mistakes became crimes. Obsession with spies. Paranoid emperors loved spies. Networks of informants spread through cities and provinces, reporting back every whisper of discontent. Neighbors spied on neighbors, courtiers spied on courtiers, and no one knew who might be listening. The result was a world where fear silenced voices. People learned to smile carefully, praise loudly, and never, ever reveal what they truly thought. To survive under a paranoid emperor was to live a double life, outwardly loyal while inwardly cautious, symbols of control to reassure themselves of their power. Emperors often turned to symbols. Statues of themselves were erected in cities, reminding everyone who ruled. Portraits, coins, and inscriptions proclaimed their greatness again and again. Some emperors insisted their names be carved on every public building. Others renamed months of the year after themselves, as though time itself should bow to their authority. These habits were not just vanity, they were shields against insecurity. If the world constantly repeated their greatness, perhaps betrayal could be held at bay. Strange rituals of protection, fear of enemies, also produced unusual rituals. Some emperors carried charms or wore special amulets believed to ward off harm. Others consulted astrologers daily, timing decisions according to the stars. One ruler reportedly refused to step outside unless a certain bird appeared in the sky, convinced it was a sign of safety. Another surrounded himself with priests, demanding constant sacrifices to keep the gods appeased. For them, superstition became a survival strategy, blending religion with paranoia. The loneliness of suspicion. Paranoia had another consequence: loneliness. When you trust no one, you are left with only yourself. Emperors distanced themselves from family, friends, and advisors, convinced that betrayal could come from any corner. Some rulers isolated themselves so completely that they became shadows. In their own palaces, seen only rarely by the people, the throne room grew quiet, the halls empty, as the emperor withdrew deeper into secrecy. And yet, despite all their precautions, betrayal often still found them. When paranoia became madness, there were times when paranoia tipped into full madness. Some emperors executed dozens, even hundreds, of people based on little more than suspicion. Others demanded loyalty tests so bizarre that no one could pass them. In the end, paranoia became self-fulfilling. The more cruel and suspicious an emperor became, the more enemies he created. The very habits meant to protect them often hastened their downfall, the human core of fear. And yet, behind the cruelty and oddity, we can still glimpse something very human. Fear of betrayal is not unique to emperors, it's part of being human. The difference was that emperors lived under such intense pressure, with so much at stake, that their fears grew into monstrous proportions. They were like anyone lying awake at night, wondering who might be against them, except their worries could command armies, alter laws, and end lives. Their paranoia shaped not only their own lives, but the fate of entire nations. A soft reflection so, as we wander slowly out of these shadowed chambers of fear, we see that emperors, despite their crowns, were never secure. They built walls, raised guards, and created endless rituals, but peace always slipped through their fingers. Power gave them everything. Yet it also took away the one thing they wanted most: safety. And as we drift gently onward, we leave behind the dark weight of paranoia and step into something brighter, though no less strange, the world of entertainment. Because when emperors weren't fearing enemies, they were staging spectacles, and their idea of fun was often as bizarre as everything else in their lives. If paranoia showed emperors at their most fearful, entertainment showed them at their most extravagant. To rule was not just to govern, it was to dazzle. Emperors needed to impress their people, silence their critics, and remind the world of their greatness. And what better way than through spectacle? Bread and circuses, as one old saying goes, could keep the masses happy or at least distracted. But emperors being emperors, their ideas of fun often tipped into the bizarre. The theater of power entertainment was never just amusement, it was politics in costume. Plays, games, and races all became tools of propaganda. When an emperor sponsored a grand performance, he wasn't simply pleasing the people. He was reminding them, I am generous, I am powerful, I am eternal. Some emperors sat in special boxes at theaters, their presence as much a performance as the actors on stage. Every cheer for the show was, in a way, a cheer for the emperor himself. And if applause grew too weak, some rulers quietly arranged for actors to start clapping on cue, just to ensure the illusion of universal admiration. Gladiators and blood. Sports' few spectacles were as infamous as gladiatorial games. Emperors loved to host them, often in arenas so vast that they seemed like cities within cities. Thousands gathered to watch fighters clash, animals roar, and dramatic battles unfold, but some emperors could not resist adding eccentric twists. Exotic animals were imported at great expense: lions from Africa, elephants from India, even crocodiles. And giraffes, the stranger, the beast, the greater the emperor's glory. Some rulers demanded naval battles staged in flooded arenas, complete with ships and sailors battling in miniature oceans. For the audience, it was thrilling. For the emperor, it was a statement. I command nature itself. The emperor, content with watching, some emperors insisted on performing themselves. One might take the stage to sing or play instruments, while others acted in plays, reciting lines with dramatic flair. Courtiers applauded with enthusiasm, whether or not the performance deserved it, because failing to clap loudly enough could be dangerous. There are tales of emperors who forced entire audiences to sit through endless performances, locking the theater doors to prevent anyone from leaving until they had finished their grand display. Imagine nodding off during a dull song, only to realize the singer was your emperor, and the guards were watching your every reaction. Lavish banquets as theater feasts, too, became entertainment. Some emperors staged banquets, less as meals and more as performances. Guests entered halls decorated like forests or oceans, with mechanical birds singing or artificial waves lapping at their feet. Dishes arrived, shaped into elaborate sculptures. Food arranged to resemble mythological creatures or legendary battles at times. The food itself became part of the entertainment. Roasted animals were presented whole, only to reveal live birds flying out when carved open. The message was clear. In the emperor's world, even meals could defy nature. Games of excess turned emperors, turned entertainment into excess. Festivals stretched on for days, sometimes weeks, with food, drink, and performances continuing without pause. Guests staggered with exhaustion, but the emperor demanded the show go on. Others invented strange contests. Who could drink the most wine? Who could eat the most food? Who could recite poetry the longest without faltering? These competitions were less about talent and more about endurance. often leaving participants miserable while the emperor laughed. Private entertainments, not all spectacles, were public. Within palace walls, emperors staged private entertainments for select guests. Musicians played late into the night, actors performed intimate dramas, acrobats twisted through torchlight. Some emperors delighted in unusual amusements. Dwarfs dressed as gladiators, trained animals performing tricks, even contests between courtiers forced into silly or humiliating roles. For the emperor, these diversions were not just playful, they were demonstrations of power. To command others to sing, dance, or even embarrass themselves on command was, in itself, entertainment. The people's perspective for citizens, these entertainments were a strange bargain. On one hand, the emperor's spectacles provided food, distraction, and moments of wonder. On the other, they reminded everyone that their ruler lived in a different world entirely, one where extravagance flowed endlessly. Still, crowds filled the arenas, theaters, and banquet halls. Even if the emperor's habits seemed bizarre, the chance to witness lions battling gladiators or ships clashing in artificial seas was too extraordinary to miss. In a world often harsh and uncertain, such spectacles offered a taste of wonder, no matter how strange the source. The emperor's ego at the heart of it all. These entertainments were reflections of imperial ego. To stage enormous games, to flood arenas, to demand applause for one's own performances. These were ways of saying, I am not just ruler, I am spectacle itself. And while the people cheered, some perhaps genuinely, others nervously, the emperor smiled. Because in those moments of applause, whether earned or forced, the emperor felt invincible. A gentle reflection, and so, in their quest to amuse, emperors revealed as much about themselves as they did about their people. They sought to dazzle because they feared being forgotten. They performed because they feared being unseen. Their spectacles, however bizarre, were ultimately about reassurance, the reassurance that they mattered, that they were loved, that their power was unshakable. As we leave the roar of arenas and the glow of banquet torches, we drift onward to another peculiar side of imperial life. Their quirks around religion and superstition. Because if emperors loved to entertain by day, they often prayed, feared, and obsessed by night. If emperors dazzled their people with spectacles, they often tried to dazzle the heavens too. To rule a vast empire was not enough. They longed for divine approval, or at least the appearance of it. Some emperors genuinely believed they were chosen by the gods. Others decided they were gods themselves. And in between, there bloomed a whole garden of strange rituals, odd superstitions, and dramatic pretensions that turned religion into yet another imperial stage. The emperor as divine in many empires. Rulers were not only political leaders, but sacred figures. Pharaohs of Egypt were seen as living gods, their every word carrying divine weight. Roman emperors too often drifted toward deification, especially after death, but some were impatient and claimed it during their lifetimes. Imagine walking into a palace and being greeted not just by a ruler, but by someone insisting you bow, as though to Jupiter or Apollo. Statues were raised not only to honor emperors, but to worship them. Temples were built where citizens could offer sacrifices, not to distant gods, but to the man who sat on the throne. Some emperors wore crowns, shaped like rays of the sun, declaring themselves shining embodiments of divine light. Others staged processions so elaborate they looked like heavenly pageants, with incense, choirs, and banners proclaiming the emperor's semi-divine nature. Endless rituals for rulers less bold. Rituals became the way to court the gods' favor. Emperors sacrificed animals in staggering numbers, filling temples with the smoke of offerings. They consulted priests, augurs, and oracles before major decisions, waiting for the right signs in the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed sheep to modern ears. It might sound strange, even unsettling, but to ancient rulers it was essential. If the signs were favorable, they marched to war. If the omens looked grim, entire campaigns were delayed or abandoned. Imagine armies of thousands waiting, not on strategy, but on whether the emperor's sacred chickens chose to eat their grain. That morning, superstitions, great and small emperors, did not stop at grand rituals. They often clung to small, personal superstitions as well. One might carry a lucky stone in his robe, rubbing it before every meeting. Another might refuse to travel on certain days of the week, convinced misfortune lurked. Some emperors became obsessed with numbers, insisting that decrees be signed only at auspicious hours or that speeches include certain counts of words. Others avoided particular foods, colors, or even animals they believed unlucky. Power did not free them from superstition, it magnified it, because they had more to lose if the gods turned against them. Dreams and prophesied dreams, too, were wrapped in sacred meaning. Many emperors kept dream interpreters close, convinced that the gods spoke through visions. A dream of victory might be announced to the whole army, boosting morale. A dream of disaster could send priests rushing to perform new sacrifices. Some rulers even staged public ceremonies to reveal their dreams, as though their private nights were messages meant for all. Of course, whether these dreams were real or invented hardly mattered. What mattered was that they reinforced the idea that the emperor was in tune with the divine, pretending to control the gods, and then there were those who went beyond, seeking the gods' favor, those who claimed to control it. Certain emperors declared themselves mediators between heaven and earth, the only ones who could speak directly to divine powers. One emperor reportedly scolded Jupiter during a thunderstorm, as though the king of the gods should be ashamed of, disturbing imperial rest. Another demanded that priests rewrite rituals so that he, not the gods, stood at the center of worship. These habits were not just arrogance, they were theater. By claiming control over the divine, emperors made themselves untouchable. When fear drove faith, but not all pretensions came from confidence. Often they came from fear. Emperors who executed rivals by day trembled at night, wondering if angry spirits would haunt them. Rituals, sacrifices, and prayers became ways to soothe guilty consciences. Some emperors spent fortunes building temples, not only to show piety but to appease gods they feared had grown angry. Others fasted, prayed, or sought visions, desperate for reassurance that the heavens still favored them. Their paranoia extended upward into the sky itself. Religion as control at the same time. Religion was a tool. By tying themselves to the gods, emperors tied their subjects to themselves. To question the emperor became to question the divine. Festivals in the emperor's honor were made mandatory. Ensuring loyalty was performed as worship. Some emperors demanded that their images be placed in temples, alongside traditional gods, forcing citizens to bow to both. In this way, the line between religion and politics blurred until they were one and the same. The loneliness of divinity yet, even in their temples and rituals. Emperors were still human. To be worshipped as a god may sound glorious, but it also meant isolation. who could speak honestly to a man declared divine, who could comfort him when he was troubled, when even his sighs were treated as prophecies. Some emperors grew weary of their own divinity, longing for moments of simple humanity. But the masks they wore were heavy, and the roles they played impossible to shed. Their pretensions to godhood trapped them as much as they elevated them. Soft reflection so, as we leave the incense-filled halls and whispering priests, we see emperors in yet another strange light, not only rulers of men, but actors in the theatre of heaven. Their rituals, their superstitions, their divine pretensions, they were ways of coping, ways of controlling, ways of dazzling. Behind the gold crowns shaped like suns and the temples built in their honor, they were still fragile humans, fearful of fate, desperate for assurance, and always craving to be remembered as more than mortal. And as we drift onward in this sleepy story, we turn from the temples of the gods to the battlefields of men. Because emperors did not only fear dreams and omens, they also carried strange habits into war itself. If emperors loved food, fashion, and feasts, they also loved war, though not always in the ways their soldiers hoped. For some, war was a calling, a chance to prove strength and expand borders. For others, it was a performance, staged for glory, more than strategy. And as with everything else in their lives, their habits on the battlefield could be just as bizarre as in the banquet hall. The emperor, who never fought some emperors, wore armor only for show. They appeared before troops in gleaming helmets and polished breastplates, but never swung a sword in anger. Soldiers knew the difference. An emperor who looked like a warrior but avoided the mud and blood of battle often inspired more jokes than loyalty. Yet, even these parade warriors mattered. Their presence alone could lift morale or sink it. If the troops realized their emperor was more concerned with how the armor shone in sunlight than how to win the war, strange battle preparations often brought superstitions with them into war. Before campaigns, they demanded sacrifices, omens, or prophecies. Some refused to march until birds flew in the right direction or thunder rolled at the right time. Others demanded entire armies wait while priests examined animal entrails for favorable signs. Imagine being a soldier, ready to move, only to be told you must wait because the emperor's sacred chickens hadn't eaten their grain yet. Such delays could frustrate generals, but no one dared complain too loudly. Extravagant camps and campaign, ordinary soldiers slept in tents or under the stars. Emperors, of course, had palaces on the move. Their camps featured enormous tents lined with silks, carpets, and furniture dragged across miles. Some even carried private bathhouses, complete with attendants and perfumes, while soldiers gnawed on hard bread. The emperor dined on delicacies prepared by traveling chefs. It was war, yes, but war conducted from the comfort of cushions. Command. From a distance, certain emperors avoided the battlefield altogether, choosing instead to command from safe distances. Messages flew back and forth, with generals waiting impatiently for imperial approval. Sometimes, by the time an order arrived, the battle was already over. Other emperors rode at the very edge of conflict, close enough to be seen, but far enough to avoid real danger. Their role was more symbolic than tactical, a reminder to troops that the emperor watched, even if he did little more than wave a sword for show. Over the top, triumphs when battles were won. Emperors turned victory into spectacle. Triumphs through city streets featured wagons of loot, chained captives, and the emperor himself paraded like a god. Statues were erected, songs composed, and coins minted to immortalize the victory. Some rulers grew addicted to these triumphs, launching wars less for necessity and more for the chance to stage another parade. For them, conquest was not about strategy or survival, but about glory carved into marble. Odd battle tactics. Not all military habits were conventional. A few emperors tried unusual strategies. One reportedly ordered mirrors placed on hillsides to blind enemy troops with sunlight. Another marched with exotic animals at the front, hoping the sight of elephants or camels would terrify opponents unused to such creatures. Some relied more on theatrics than tactics, dressing armies in dazzling uniforms or staging elaborate pre-battle speeches that dragged on for hours. Soldiers may have wished for quick commands, but emperors often preferred grand gestures. Fear and cowardice. Not every emperor was brave. Some panicked at the first sound of battle, retreating to safety while leaving generals to fight. A few abandoned campaigns entirely, rushing home when omens grew dark or dreams turned unsettling. Of course, official accounts rarely admitted cowardice. Chroniclers rephrased failures as strategic withdrawals or sacred caution, but whispers among soldiers told the truth. Cruelty in war, paranoia, and cruelty often followed emperors onto the battlefield. Some punished entire cities for resisting, leveling walls and enslaving populations. Others grew suspicious of their own soldiers, executing officers for imagined disloyalty. War, which already brought suffering, became even harsher under rulers who used it to feed their fears. The loneliness of command yet. For all their extravagance and arrogance, emperors in war were often deeply alone, surrounded by troops, banners, and trumpets. They carried the heavy burden of knowing that every decision could cost thousands of lives. No robe or jewel could shield them from that weight. And so, their odd habits, whether sacred chickens, tents, or endless parades, were perhaps ways of softening the unbearable reality of war. They turned battle into ritual, performance, or theater because the alternative was too terrifying. The simple, brutal truth of blood and chaos. A gentle reflection as we drift away from their camps and battlefields. We leave behind the sound of marching boots and clashing swords. We see that emperors, for all their power, were often awkward warriors, wrapped in superstition, comfort, and fear. Their wars were not only contests of armies, but displays of ego, oddity, and insecurity. And now, as our sleepy story continues, we step into something more personal still. The strange legacies emperors left behind. Because when the wars ended and the crowns grew heavy, many emperors turned their eccentricity toward the one thing that would outlast them, how they wished to be remembered. Emperors spent their lives surrounded by rituals, luxury, and odd habits. But perhaps the strangest habits of all appeared not in life, but in how they prepared for death and how they demanded to be remembered afterward. Power fades, crowns slip, and empires crumble, but emperors often refuse to accept this. Instead, they tried to control memory itself, leaving behind legacies as curious as their lives. Preparing for the end, most ordinary people faced death with little control. They were buried quickly, often with only modest rites. Emperors, however, had entire teams of priests, architects, and advisors devoted to planning their departures. Some spent years preparing elaborate tombs. Vast chambers were carved from stone, treasures piled high, and attendants instructed on complex rituals. Death, for them, was not an ending but another stage of performance. Even in their final rest, they wanted to impress. Tombs of grandeur. Tombs of emperors often dwarfed the homes of their subjects. Great pyramids, mausoleums, and monumental burial sites rose as lasting symbols of their power. But grandeur came with strangeness. Some emperors demanded their tombs be hidden, sealed, or cursed to prevent enemies from disturbing them. Others ordered that no one should know their final resting place, as though secrecy could grant them immortality. One emperor even decreed that rivers should be diverted over his tomb, concealing it forever beneath flowing water. The message was clear. Even in death, I command nature. Death rituals, funerals for emperors were rarely solemn affairs. They were massive public events, part mourning, part propaganda. Processions wound through streets with statues, banners, and chants declaring the emperor's greatness. Sometimes actors were hired to impersonate the dead ruler, speaking lines as though the emperor still lived, reminding the people of his presence. In some traditions, emperors were burned on towering pyres, flames leaping toward the sky as symbols of divinity. In others, their bodies were dressed in elaborate robes, placed in golden coffins, and displayed for all to see before burial. Death itself became theatre, with the emperor as the central star. Strange demands, many emperors left unusual instructions. For their funerals, some insisted on being buried with armies of statues or even living servants sacrificed to accompany them. Others ordered vast feasts in their honor, as though their departure should be celebrated as much as mourned. A few demanded bizarre rituals, that animals be slaughtered, that entire cities participate in mourning, or that the sun itself be honored with special ceremonies. For emperors, even death was an opportunity to prove they were unlike anyone else. Deification after death in many empires. Rulers became gods after death. Priests declared their spirits divine. Temples were built in their honor and sacrifices offered at their altars. Citizens were told to worship the emperor alongside traditional gods, ensuring that his presence never truly faded. Of course, not all emperors earned such treatment. Some were so despised that after death, their names were erased from monuments, their statues smashed, and their legacies cursed. This damnation of memory was the opposite of divinity, a deliberate attempt to erase a ruler from history itself. Monuments in memory, those who were remembered often left monuments that still stand today. Arches carved with victories, columns inscribed with conquests, temples bearing their names. Yet even these monuments sometimes revealed oddities. A ruler might demand his statue appear larger than life, towering absurdly over others. Another might order portraits with features exaggerated Ds wider, muscles stronger, posture more divine than reality ever allowed. These choices remind us that emperors were not content simply to rule in life. They wanted to shape how they were seen forever. Memory itself became something to command. The fear of being forgotten behind the grandeur, however, lingered fear. Emperors knew that power was fleeting, and death would strip them of control. Their strange habits around legacies were, at heart, attempts to fight that truth. By building vast tombs, demanding divine honors, or staging extravagant funerals, they hoped to cheat oblivion. Yet history shows a quiet irony. Some of the emperors who worked hardest to be remembered are now little more than footnotes. Others, who built less, are still famous centuries later. Memory, like power, cannot be fully commanded. Soft reflection so. In their final acts, emperors showed us once again the mix of majesty and absurdity that defined their lives. They tried to carry crowns into the grave, to wrap themselves in rituals, to turn even death into theatre. And perhaps that is their strangest legacy of all that in their desperate quest for immortality, they revealed how fragile they truly were. For no matter how grand the tomb, no matter how divine the honors, every emperor was still human. Dust in the end, like the rest of us. As we drift onward from tombs and funerals, we come to the gentle close of our sleepy story, for there is one last thing to explore, what these habits truly mean. Because behind all the oddities, whether in food, fashion, dreams, or death, there is a quiet reminder about power, fear, and humanity. We have wandered through many chambers of imperial life, from dawn rituals to midnight fears, from feasts that bent the rules of nature to tombs that tried to outlast time itself. We have seen emperors not only as rulers but as strange, fragile humans. Their lives shimmered with grandeur, but also quivered with oddities, insecurities, and habits that remind us how even the most powerful were never free from being human. The burden of crowns, too, where a crown looked like glory, yet for emperors it was also a weight. They lived surrounded by servants, courtiers, and guards, yet often they were lonelier than anyone else in their empire. Every robe was heavy with meaning, every meal shadowed by suspicion, every dream interpreted as fate. Their strange habits, whether sleeping in fear, feasting in excess, or demanding endless applause, were not just quirks of character. They were coping mechanisms, ways of holding on to control in a world where control could vanish overnight. The theater of power, so much of their life was theater. The banquets, the parades, the rituals, the costumes, all performances staged for audiences of thousands or even millions. To rule was to act, to play the role of god or conqueror, to embody symbols larger than life. But behind the stage lights of history, the actors were human. They stumbled, they worried, they longed for affection, they feared betrayal. Even their most bizarre habits, the sacred chickens, the endless monuments, were expressions of something familiar, the desire to feel safe, loved, remembered. Power and fear, perhaps. What stands out most is how power and fear were intertwined. The higher the throne, the greater the fear of falling. Emperors guarded themselves with soldiers, charms, and rituals, yet still trembled at night. They ruled millions, yet could not rule their own hearts. It is easy to laugh at their eccentricities, to shake our heads at their flamingo tongues or gem-encrusted robes. But beneath the strangeness lies something we all recognize. Who among us has not sought comfort in small rituals, or chased reassurance in superstitions, or feared being forgotten? The difference is scale. An emperor's bedtime worry might shape armies. Our own may only shape our dreams. The fragile legacy, in the end, emperors tried to command not only their subjects, but memory itself. They built monuments to last forever, demanded divine honors, staged funerals to echo through time. Yet many of their names have faded, while others linger in ways they never expected. Their fragility is, perhaps, the most human part of their story. For all their power, they could not control time. And yet, through their odd habits, they remain with us not as perfect gods or flawless heroes, but as strange, vivid, sometimes ridiculous, always fascinating human beings. A gentle farewell, so. As we close this sleepy history tale, we see emperors for what they truly were. Not untouchable giants, but people wrapped in costumes of power. People who laughed, worried, loved, feared, and sometimes behaved in ways that make us smile in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, their strangeness helps us rest a little easier. Because if emperors, men who ruled empires, who commanded armies, who were worshipped as gods, still fussed over fashion, feared bad dreams, and clung to lucky charms. Then perhaps our own little oddities are not so strange after all, so let the story drift away now, soft as candlelight fading in a quiet hall. The emperors, with their jewels and fears, their spectacles and scandals, can rest in history. And you, too, can rest comforted by the thought that even the mightiest were simply human, strange, yes, grand, yes, but human always. Good night.